Hi, everybody. We will begin momentarily as people begin to trickle in. We're so excited to have you here. All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Abolition in the Legal Field, a discussion about abolitionism in the classroom and beyond, hosted by UCLA Law's Criminal Justice Society. Before we begin, I want to give honor to the land that UCLA and UCLA Law currently resides on. We acknowledge the Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of the Los Angeles Basin and Southern Channel Islands, and are grateful to have the opportunity to work for the indigenous peoples in this place. As a land-grant institution, we pay our respects to ancestors, elders, and our relatives and relations past, present, and emerging. I also want to acknowledge that honoring land and its indigenous caretakers requires action from UCLA Law to commit to admitting and financially supporting Native students, especially Tongva students, who UCLA Law has not had in attendance once at their school since their founding. I also encourage that land be given back to Native peoples and monetary reparations be given to all indigenous peoples dispossessed from their lands at the hands of the United States, including Black people whose ancestors were enslaved. Lastly, in spirit of this event, I want to acknowledge that decolonization and abolition are the only paths forward in which all indigenous peoples, including displaced indigenous peoples, will be free. My name is Grace Carson. I'm Criminal Justice Society's Communication Chair and a Dene and Chicana 2L abolitionist law student who has struggled to find space to advocate for abolition and thus decolonization in legal spaces. This is why we organize this event today. Before I begin, I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Criminal Justice Program, the Promise Institute for Human Rights, Prison Law and Policy Program, the Critical Race Studies Program, David J. Epstein Program in Public Interest Law and Policy, Prison Education Program and Abolition Curriculum, and the National Lawyers Guild UCLA. Thank you for helping make hosting this event possible. Our experience as law students has been that there is no room to discuss abolition in our classes, and when it is brought up by students, it's seen as too radical and irrelevant to the project of learning legal doctrine. Our belief is that abolition thinking and praxis is important in all aspects of life, but especially in the legal field. We are holding this panel to share this vision with our fellow students, professors, and deans, hoping to make room for discussion of abolition and in our classroom and in the legal field, and show that abolitionist perspectives can promote a deep understanding of the law. Further, our goal with this event is that we wanted to intentionally focus on the voices of Black, Indigenous, women of color, because we know that these are the people who are leading the conversation about abolition and who have the most at stake in this conversation. You are encouraged to use the Q&A function for questions, which we will get to by the end of the event. It is my immense honor to introduce these 5 incredible scholars, teachers, community advocates, and lawyers, and to moderate the conversation as these discuss these issues. So now we're going to lead into a panelist introductions. Alicia, if you would like to go first and also talk about the upcoming Call Festival.
Yeah, thank you so much, Grace, for that introduction, and to Grace and Sarah and the Criminal Justice Society for organizing this event and for inviting me to participate. Hi to everybody who is here. Thank you for joining us. My name is Alicia Virani. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the director of the Criminal Justice Program here at UCLA School of Law, also a graduate of UCLA School of Law, class of 2011 from the Critical Race Studies and Epstein Program of Public Interest Law and Policy graduate. And really briefly, and I think there will be some links dropped in the chat, we're hosting an event on April 16th and 17th called the Connecting Art and Law for Liberation Festival, which will bring together lawyers and artists to imagine abolitionist futures. We'll be having a panel presentation, performances, and interactive workshops led by artists and lawyers collaboratively to think about how we can use art to promote change and to end mass incarceration. So those links are in the chat. We would love to see you attend, and that's it for me.
I'll jump in. I'm India Tusi. I'm an associate professor of law at Delaware Law School. And I'm really excited to be joining this conversation today, and thank Grace and for the Criminal Justice Society for inviting me.
Thank you. Anyone could go next?
Yeah, happy to jump in. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Yvette Ale. My pronouns are they, them, and I welcome others to share their pronouns as well. I'm the senior policy lead at Dignity and Power Now and one of the co-founders of La Defensa. I'm also the coordinator of the Justice LA Coalition, and we are a Los Angeles-based coalition of over 50 organizations that work to reduce the footprint of incarceration and the prison industrial complex as large. We identify as an abolitionist coalition, and I myself am an abolitionist. And I'll also share that I'm also a survivor of interpersonal, domestic, and intimate partner violence. So I bring those experiences and that intersectional analysis around abolition to this conversation. Thank you for having me.
Hey, all right. Good afternoon, everybody. First, I want to say thank you so much to Grace and to Sarah and all those who worked so hard to organize this event. I know it's nothing short of 3 million emails and sleepless nights putting together agenda. So I just want to honor that labor and say thank you so much. It's not an easy thing to do as a student. And thank you to everybody who's here with us this afternoon. So exciting to see, well, I just see numbers, not faces, but it's exciting to see that you're all there. Hello. And thank you and hello to my co-panelists. I'm always excited to have these conversations. So I'm grateful to know you and to see you, and any new face I see on a Zoom screen is great. New faces, I miss faces. So I'm excited. My name is Stephanie Lumsden. I use she and her pronouns, please. I'm a Hoopa tribal member, a lecturer in ethnic studies at Mills right now, and as well as a 5th year graduate student in gender studies at UCLA. So I've got irons in the fire, many irons. I'm an abolitionist by practice. I've done some organizing work in LA with CCWP and some direct advocacy work. I'm now speaking to you up here from We Out Lands in Humboldt County near my own reservation, where I continue to do work to support formerly incarcerated people. So yeah, I'm really excited to have this conversation and talk a little bit more about all of our work and how they relate. So thank you again so much.
Titi Leo, if you want to introduce yourself if you're ready.
Yes, hi, my name is Titlaya Rasaki. I apologize for my state right now. Abolitionists need vacations too, and then they don't realize that they agreed to do a panel during their vacation. But deep gratitude to everyone who helped put this panel together, especially you, Grace. My name is Titlaya Rasaki. I'm a policy associate at SE Justice Group. Prior to joining SE, I was in big law, partly because of my experience as the daughter of an incarcerated person who was reentering at a time when I was completing my law degree. And I will say that the experience of having my father incarcerated during my legal training was just kind of the anchor that really helped me to explore and criticize and question the legal apparatus as it was, how my family and people I loved were experiencing it, and what it means for the trajectories of particularly women with incarcerated loved ones who end up being the backbone of the reentry system and how that played out in my own life and in the healing work that myself and my family had to do and are continuing to do. So yeah, I think my lens of abolition really came about through love, through study with people who challenged me to think bigger and more critically about, again, the structures that we all face and experience and don't quite know the answers for why they're happening to us, and to dream about creating a world that, marshals resources, that divests resources from, death-making systems and reaffirms life, and allocates budgets. I believe budgets now are a love language, right? There are collective love letters to ourselves. And so, yeah, now my work is rooted in harnessing that love, harnessing that healing and that power into, divesting from every single system that, harms our people, and creating, envisioning new ones. As part of the Justice LA Coalition, as part of kind of the LA powerhouse that Yvette is just such an anchor for, and I'm just such, I look up to Yvette so much in my organizing and my learning. So I'm just glad to be a part of this panel, excited to be in conversation with y'all. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for sharing, and thank you all so much for your time and for all the labor you do, both on this panel and outside of this panel. I'm so grateful to you all and to look up to each and every one of you as a path forward as a future lawyer and advocate. So our first question that we have for you is, how do you understand abolition, and how do you explain or define abolition to others? Anybody can answer at any time as they feel necessary.
I'm happy to kick us off, and I'd love to start off by talking about some myths about what abolition is, because I come across this a lot with folks when we're engaging around discussions around abolition. And I think the first myth about abolition is that abolition is the absence of accountability. And I want to name that first and foremost, that abolition is not a lack of accountability. It's actually creating better, more effective structures of accountability. And the second myth that I hear a lot is that abolition is just about destroying the system. And it's, for me, equally as much about dismantling the current systems of oppression as it is, like Titilaya was referencing, building out the type of world we want to see. So in order to have the bandwidth, the resources, the freedom to build out the type of world that we want to see, part of that is dismantling, capturing the dollars, capturing the resources that are currently being wasted on failed systems that are actually not rooted in accountability and justice, but are actually rooted in white supremacy, colonialism, displacement, and ultimately the stealing and murdering of our community members, those community members that are already most impacted by these systems. And so for me, those are the two main takeaways I really hope folks can absorb and sit with as we're going through this conversation.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to chime in about their ideas or understanding of abolition?
Yeah, let's jump in now. Yeah, thank you. When I think about what abolition is, how I define that, lucky for me, the work isn't mine alone to do, right? Like, how do I explain it? So I follow in the paths of many incredible abolitionist scholars and activists, formerly incarcerated people in leadership positions in our organizations and our communities, and in how we articulate the future. I'm also beholden, right? Obliged to give all the credit to incredible Black feminist abolitionist scholarship, which have consistently provided us leadership, insight. I know we all exist right now in the wake of Miriam Kava's beautiful book, and it's really a thrilling time to think through this work. So how I define it is, I'm like, citation them, right? Like, same. But I think, I know we've all, or many of us who do abolitionist work and are attentive to that scholarship, have echoes in our minds of Ruth Wilson Gilmore's word, that abolition is a presence, right? And few things get summed up more beautifully than that, I think. Like, it's about presence. It's an objection to what she calls organized abandonment. So like, look around in our communities and in our lives, and where have you been abandoned? And then abolition is about providing something there. So I don't want to begrudge the burn it down, because in my heart, that's where I want to be. That's the party I want to go to, is the burn it down party. But abolition is more about the sustained, like, building, right? Like, we're builders, and imperfect ones. And I do also, when I explain abolition to people, I say it's not a final product, it's a project, it's a process, it's a relation of justice that we make with each other, right? We need each other. And that sounds like kumbaya and hand holding and like whatever, but until you meet more than like 3 people, because people are the most difficult thing in your life, right? So abolition is hard work. And it's also like the most rewarding, I think. We get to build the world we want to live in. So burn it down party, and then the lifelong work, right, is really making a presence. And yeah, it's you should join, right? Like, it's the coolest party in town, right?
I don't have too much to add. I'll just say, and thank you for that. Even when both of you were talking about abolition, and I see at least a few faces I can see here, and I see faces light up. And for me, abolition is joy, and it's about the practice of joy and bringing that into our lives. And again, I think sometimes when we talk about this, people can think we're sounding kumbaya-ish or very pie in the sky, but there are very real things that we want to see in the world that I think a lot of abolitionists are putting out there. So that presence that Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Stephanie brought up. I also think that abolition really requires like such an intersectional and overlapping understanding of systems of oppression. So it's not just something that's in relation to the criminal legal system and tearing it down, but the question is how we need to be identifying the conditions that allow for policing, prison, surveillance to exist in the first place, right? And those things are some of the systemic oppressions that exist: white supremacy, histories of colonization, settler colonialism, and what exists now: housing inequality, right? Redlining, racism in employment, right? So there are all of these different areas, and I think one of the things that happens, and I know we'll talk about this more in legal education, is we get really siloed into these different areas of practice, right? And so for me, abolition is really requiring us to not do that and really come together and all realize that we're all trying to address many of the same conditions that lead to all of these poor outcomes, mostly for Black and Brown communities.
I just want to
go ahead.
I was just going to jump in, not to give a clear definition, but just from what I've heard from everyone, just to uplift that point of how abolition is about building up the society that we want to be in and to exist in, right? Because it's not just about tearing down one particular institution, right? Because if you're tear down that institution and you're in a white supremacist society, or where the vestiges of settler colonialism remain, then a new institution will spring up, right? But it's also about affirmatively building up that society and also creating those material conditions where these other oppressive institutions are no longer necessary. They become irrelevant.
Thank you for that, India. And, like very similarly, to me, abolition is about hope. It's about hope in humanity. It's about hope and fundamentally believing in the redeemability, right? That the divinity, the dignity, the fullness, and the unlimited potential in each human being. It's seeing systems that throw people away and that judge them and hold them to the worst moment of their lives, the worst thing that they potentially may have ever done. And to me, like, at least in my personal experience of it, abolition, in the questioning of why and the questioning of the system and the indictments and the kind of finger pointing of just, yeah, the kind of the material existence that we live in, you know, recognizing that there are three fingers pointing back, right? That there's a lot inside of me, a lot of judgments inside of me, a lot of the ways in which, like, I don't know, that we have been steeped in these systems. And that they're self-perpetuating because they've embedded themselves in our psyche, that they've embedded themselves in the ways that we believe, you know, like, yeah, the ways that we judge ourselves, the way that we judge each other, the ways that we just think that people are disposable. And abolition to me is a reconciliation. It's a re-recognition of the fact that if I can recognize inherent dignity in myself, if I can, you know, recognize the inherent divinity in myself, then I can, you know, extend that to somebody else. And really, for me, abolition is about like that internal building and that internal kind of reconciliation back to self. And I feel like that internal work and that internal decolonization of the, you know, the ways in which I've, you know, accepted certain things and allowed them to be part of my mental framework. Yeah, so for me, it's about, just as much as we're recreating new systems outside of us, that we're recreating ourselves and being transformed in the service of the work so that we can, yeah, like be more grace, like be more open and be more able to begin again over and over again as many times as is needed. Yes, that there is accountability, but that there's also grace, right? That there's also that there's that dance of just fallibility and redeemability. I think that that's the dance to me.
Thank you all for sharing. I think I speak for everybody when I say that your understanding of abolition is very, I just think, beautiful. And for me, it just fills my heart. And that for me is what abolition is. It goes back to what Alicia said when she said it's joy. And that's what I feel whenever we come together and have these discussions with one another. And so our next question is, and we kind of talked about this a little bit, some of you in your definitions and in your introductions, but how did you come into your current view on abolition? How has that journey played out in your work, your personal life, and your communities?
We can start. Yeah, thinking about how it's changed. I think I came to abolition as a student who took a class with a really important teacher, right? And showed me all these beautiful things to read and have provided me with like a working, like kind of academic definition for my own self and my career. But how did I, like, how it has changed because of my life and the people around me and who I feel responsible to, is like kind of the other side of that coin, right? It was just like, I learned about all these things and I understand the urgency and their importance and could kind of like put the pieces together and be like, yeah, I see that as like a good way to keep thinking, to think ourselves out of this problem. But I think it wasn't until I started doing some advocacy and some providing like some support, community support for formerly incarcerated people and incarcerated people, that I realized that what abolition actually meant to me, versus like, I know how to write a paper about it, but what did it actually mean to me to be an abolitionist, came from just seeing the dearth of care in other people's lives, like the lack of support they have, the lack of humanity, right? Like they're afforded, right? No second chances for some people. And I think developing relationships with others and understanding that care is part of the presence that's missing, right? And part of the presence that we can kind of fill in mutual aid and helping each other just survive this, has come to be kind of my gut feeling around what abolition is. Like, it's about these grander projects of eventually ending the state, right? That's like a decolonial abolitionist was like, the state must go. But in like the interpersonal or like more community kind of structures of community, it has meant to me showing up for others and being generous, not just with my not in like a charity sort of way, but in a generosity of spirit, in a extending yourself, extending vulnerability to one another, as well as like actual brass tacks, like I have a stipend that exceeds my cost of living this month, so it's up to me to give $300 to somebody, right? It's up to me to support bail funds and other things. So I think one hand's like the woo-woo, our relationship, extending our networks of kin, right? Actually extending care to others, and because that's some of what's lacking. And the other is like, yeah, actually monies are owed here, and some of us have more than we need, and that's also not right. So both mutual aid and extending care has become kind of the hands-on practical thing for me with abolition in this moment.
I really love the framing that Stephanie just presented. And I think my journey to abolition, I think the seeds were planted pretty early on. Is that even if our community members or our families may not have the language of abolition, we understand it to be a practice. And especially our most marginalized community members have generationally been practicing abolition because the system itself works to target them, right? So I think about, being a young person, I was undocumented most of my life. And I'm also the child of a formerly incarcerated person, and having experienced domestic violence in the home, being undocumented, calling the police was never an option, not for my mom. She knew that if the police came, that we would be taken away from her, that she may herself be criminalized, and that our whole family could be deported. And so I understood that the system was not designed to protect us from a very young age. So when my dad became incarcerated, we had no family here, no support networks. We didn't have access to any resources. All we were able to really get was, boxes of free food from the church on Sundays. But outside of that, we had no resources. We lost our home. We were houseless. I lived in cars and in garages. And so I knew from my lived experience, my day-to-day experience, that the system was fundamentally flawed, that it's not working, that I couldn't rely on the system, and that all I could rely on is my family and my chosen family. And chosen family for me has been incredibly life-saving. I'm also a queer person, and so I could not, at some point when I came out, I could not live with my family. I was not accepted. And so just seeing the networks of chosen family that have sustained TGI and LGB folks for generations, the framework and the foundations that were established by folks like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, who really use the framework of we take care of us. The system's not going to take care of us, right? And I really got my language around abolition, like the things I already knew and felt and experienced when I was interning for an abolitionist organization in the Bay Area called Justice Now. And I got the opportunity to support participatory documentation of human rights violations inside of the women's prisons of Chowchilla. And for many, many years, the folks incarcerated in those cages had experienced, medical neglect, had been sterilized against their will, and there were folks that I connected with while supporting inside of those prisons that really gave me my language, my framework for what abolition means, and it was through that experience that I realized there was language, there were words that I could attach to what I already knew was true. And so that for me, just reconciling, my politics and my lived experience within that framework of abolition was life-changing. So when I think about, what abolition is to me, it was also my language and my pathway for forgiveness. Because while I held the trauma of experiencing domestic violence at the hand of my father, I also loved my father. And my sister and I searched for him. We didn't know where he was incarcerated. And for years, we wanted to reconcile and find him. And it was often in my mind at odds. Like I love this person, and this person committed, really awful harms to me and my family. But having the framework of abolition allowed me to also reconcile those internal pieces that felt at odds with each other, and gave me the tools and the pathway for forgiveness and for healing that just relying on the current system would have never afforded me.
Yvette, I stand you. Always, 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 I stand. Wow. Yeah, like Yvette, I came to abolition as well through friction, and through like that friction of an experience with the incarceration of my father. I think it was like maybe a sophomore or junior year of my college experience, where I was starting to learn about like the new Jim Crow, starting to understand the system, but generally like in trust of the system, just kind of being like, as an, immigrant, I came to America when I was 7. I was just like, the system is what it is. It's here to help us, whatever. But then, yeah, like in my junior year, like essentially like accusations came out where my father was accused of having sexually assaulted people who he was charged with taking care of. He was a medical doctor who was then, patients came forward and made accusations against him. And in that experience, throughout that experience, as we dealt with the criminal legal system, as we dealt with what bail looked like, and bail, the issue with bail ended up like being like my mom ended up having to just do so much to come up with so much bail, and then like it got increased, but throughout like our experience and interface with the criminal legal system, like whatever the criminal legal system was throwing towards us as his family, like was eviscerating every sense of security that we could have, right? No matter what my mom could do, like she was the one that was essentially experiencing the brunt of the criminal legal system's quote unquote accountability against my father. And I think for me, it's just that understanding of just like, like when we experience, or when it is understood, or maybe, raised in our community that harm, like somebody may have experienced harm, the criminal legal system's interrogation or investigation is not necessarily to rectify that harm, right? Like throughout our family, like to this day, like nobody has acknowledged or, really investigated or really gone down to the bottom of whether or not those people's accusations were, like that, whether or not they experienced that, and whether or not they were healed or received the kind of support that they needed to be able to, so essentially like first, throughout my firsthand experience of it, it was just an experience of just realizing that the criminal legal system was more like interested in like caging and incarcerating and siphoning or like drawing resources from our family, from, the community, in terms of like keeping him out of a cage, or like just essentially like playing defense instead of like actually addressing head on the actual harm that was alleged, and actually supporting those people in actually receiving the healing that they needed, and also my father in terms of the healing that he needed, right? Like none of that was ever the discussion. And even when he was incarcerated, again, like it was just this like veil of silence that ended up just smothering my whole entire family. And so like my journey to abolition was just like experiencing all this and asking why, and asking kind of like, what is the system's answer to this? And like realizing, during law school and et cetera, like that all the systems that are in place are like ill-equipped to actually address harm, to actually address like that there is harm, and actually support in terms of providing resources for healing, right? And that a cage is not really accountability, because at the end of the day, like my father received a cage, right? With his resources and with his intellect, he was able to reduce his sentence to like, maybe he got, I think 3 years, and then came out, and like, my family had to like support him in reentry, but like nobody's really ever addressed this harm. Nobody's addressed whether or not like what's going on, So again, like to me, abolition, I've come to abolition in friction, right? In the tensions, in like recognizing that somebody that I love has done harm to people, and that person needs help, and that all those other people that they may have harmed need help, and that the system is not doing any of that. And all it's doing is actually just drawing more resources away from community, just the ramifications and kind of the fallout in my family just really drove me to questioning why and how is the system really working. And I came into law school thinking I was gonna be Thurgood Marshall, thinking that the courts are where you go to for answers. And I quickly learned that that was not the case, and that we have to, interrogate, dismantle, and then rebuild something that actually addresses harm. Nobody's talking about harm. Nobody's talking about survivors. And so even in the legislation that we work on at SE, et cetera, my focus is always on that, because it really is we need resources for healing. We don't need more cages, because cages don't hold people accountable. Cages don't heal people. Cages don't heal the people that harm people. And so the criminal legal system's kind of answer is always inept to actually address harm.
Thank you all for that. And thank you so much for sharing and for your vulnerability. I think that it's really important when discussing abolition. I think of the times whenever I've gotten the retort from abolitionists, what about, people who sexually assault? What about people who commit murder? And my response is, of course, to building systems of care also, but that many of us are survivors of sexual assault, are survivors of domestic violence. And that's how we've come to be abolitionists. And so I think that our words here today have said that. Professor Thestia, did you have something to add?
Sure. And I agree in terms of just really appreciating the comments from my co-panelists. And so for me, abolition feels like an acknowledgement of things that I've always kind of known. And, I think just from growing up, the system was broken unless, you're measuring whether it's doing a good job at maintaining social hierarchies. But I grew up in Yonkers and the Bronx. And at the time I graduated from public high school in Yonkers, the school soon after I graduated was recognized as being racially segregated and ended up being put in a consent decree. And the city itself was under a consent decree for residential segregation. I didn't know this at the time. It's only when I, entered law school that I realized, the community that I was in was so racially segregated. And so there's so much discrimination there. And, within that social context, when I was in high school, I witnessed many of my Black classmates get incarcerated by the end of our senior year. And it was just routine. It was just normalized. We were numb to it. There was even a game around it about, who would make it to the end of senior year without some sort of marijuana charge or the other, right? And, the police in that community were hostile, violent, overtly racist. We avoided the police. I guess we were engaged in our own sort of abolitionist praxis. We knew we couldn't call on the police. And, being able to go through that experience, go through college, realize just how abnormal that was, really kind of fueled my desire to, at the time, work within that political system and push back against it. And now I'm at a point where I'm trying to work without a criminal legal system, or imagine a system or a world without it. And so I worked as a civil rights lawyer at the ACLU, and I was trying to be deliberate about the choices I was making when I went to law school and after. But I had always been skeptical of the police and the criminal system, but it wasn't until I would say the last few years that I really think I have embraced more abolition explicitly. It's not something I was taught at any school I went to, but it's really through organizing and activism, demands of activists, maybe starting around 2015 or so, when I really started to engage with abolition as being a viable political project. And, the fact that communities most affected by the system have been calling for us to divest from, the criminal legal system and invest in them, invest in the communities is, I think really what made me realize that, I should think about these demands seriously. I know, and I knew, just from my own experience, that the system wasn't working as it should be. It was fundamentally unfair, right? The fact that, young Black kids could be put into jail for years during that time for marijuana, whereas, I went to college and realized that was not the case for people in other communities. And so I guess it's just an appreciation for what we've been doing has not been working. We've been doing it for decades. It's had an opportunity to work. It hasn't worked, and it's time to kind of move on and create a system where everyone can be supported.
I'll jump in really briefly, and I want to give a shout out to Insight Women of Color Against Violence, because that's really where I, within that group, I started or restarted a local chapter in Los Angeles when I came out here for law school. And someone gave me a copy of the Insight anthology, The Color of Violence. And if folks haven't read it, you absolutely should. It's a book that really focuses a lot on different methods of community accountability. And so really learning about how communities were taking back the solutions into their own hands and really caring for each other, really working to encourage accountability for harms that occurred, thanks for dropping the link. That was really a lot of my inspiration around abolition. And then in law school, I became connected with folks who were doing restorative justice work. I think at the time, I'm not sure, I don't know if transformative justice had emerged at that time yet, but really thinking about restorative justice as what we would like to build instead, restorative and transformative justice. And throughout my evolution as a lawyer, I've always come back to that. So after I graduated, I started a restorative justice alternative program for young people, as an alternative to the juvenile justice system. And then I was a public defender and really felt there so much tension between my abolitionist ideals and what I was doing on a daily basis. Even though I think public defenders are able to do a lot of harm reduction, I also think that there's a way in which we get schooled in the punitive logics and kind of can fall prey to them, particularly because of the structures that exist, the structural issues that exist, lack of funding for public defenders' offices, really high caseloads, right? But I feel like my abolitionist politics sharpened even more when I was in court every single day and seeing how the system just ran right over people, that people were not able to talk, and speak if they wanted to be accountable for what they had done, that they weren't given any outlet for that, right? And my advice to them was always, don't say anything about what you did, right? Because the harm that the system can cause if someone admits guilt, right, is so drastic. But at the same time, I came from this restorative justice perspective that was like, you need to process through you need to go through that process of accountability if you're ready. And I think many of my clients would have been able to really benefit from something like that. But I just saw really how there was absolutely no room for accountability or healing for either party or all the parties involved. And so I think that trajectory just really even more sharpened my desire to really figure out how can I be an abolitionist lawyer.
Thank you all for sharing. So our next question is, what does it mean to practice abolition in your professional work? And what do you say to people who question whether abolition is useful at all, or question whether abolition has a space in legal work or scholarship?
Yeah, I can kick us off. So I'm not a lawyer. So I just want to start there. But I do work in policy. I write laws, I get them passed. I work with impacted communities. So formerly incarcerated people, the families of formerly incarcerated people, to develop those policies. We do that collectively, right? And we use our lived experience, which is our expertise, because we've gone through the system or been impacted by the system in some way. We are experts. We're subject matter experts in this, in the criminal legal system. So I just wanted to start there, that, we don't need a law degree. We don't need any degree to be experts in what we've lived through, right? And in terms of integrating abolition, another myth that I'll name is that abolition can't be incremental. A lot of the work that we do has a harm reduction component to it. We know that in order to help alleviate the current suffering that our community members and our loved ones are experiencing, sometimes it looks like an incremental change that we can pass immediately. But it's important in the work that we do through an abolitionist lens to ground ourselves in some key analysis around whether that policy, whether that law, that change that we're trying to make in the system is going to advance our abolitionist agenda, our abolitionist goals, or whether it's actually going to undermine us, right? Because sometimes the immediate policy victory, it could feel good at the time, but it actually does harm to our long struggle towards abolition, towards creating the system that we want to see. And so there's some key questions that we ask ourselves as we're developing those policies. And thank you, Sarah, for dropping the link. Critical Resistance has a really great visual representation of those questions, but I'll walk us through a few of those. So we ask ourselves, does this policy reduce the number of people incarcerated and the people that are under surveillance and any other form of state control? Because I'll name, abolition is not just about destroying jails and prisons, right? We see the reach of the system and the taking of agency through the medical industrial complex, for instance, like folks that don't have agency in terms of what healing looks like for them. So we ask ourselves that first question, and does it reduce the number of jails and prisons and surveillance in our everyday lives, right? And is that policy creating resources and infrastructure that's steadily preventative and accessible without police and prison guards contact, right? So are we actually reducing the contact between law enforcement and our communities? And does that policy strengthen the capacity to prevent or address and create processes for community accountability that Alicia did such a great job just laying out? So we ask ourselves these questions every time that we consider a policy, because we don't want to create anything that we have to dismantle in the future. So for instance, the issue of prison overcrowding. Often we hear, well, we need to build better state-of-the-art prisons or better state-of-the-art jails. That's how Twin Towers got built in 1997, right? And yet what we see is that creating more state-of-the-art jail facilities is not actually getting to the root causes of the issue, right? Providing folks in the community with housing, with employment, with mental health care, like those things get to the root causes of incarceration and policing, right? How many cops we have on the street and how they target our community members, like reducing that and ultimately eliminating that gets to the root causes of criminalization. And so asking ourselves the critical questions along the way, and also working to address the root causes rather than just the symptoms that we're experiencing. And that's how we integrate the abolitionist lens and into policy making.
Yeah.
Thank you, Yvette. And I hate following Yvette because I just feel like they just summed it up so perfectly. And yeah, like to the question, I think like folks with the legal analysis, it's important to understand that while working within the legal apparatus, like it makes sense, right? Like one of my close friends says the front line is exactly where you are. So if your front line is as a public defender, or other ways of using the legal kind of tool to shape and recreate the system, go for it, right? Or, to block more people from being fed into incarceration, into state control, really important. It's exceptionally important. And it's important for us to, whether it's within the frame of movement lawyering, quote unquote, or community lawyering, understanding that while your legal analysis is great, it's helpful, it's useful, it does not make you exceptional at all. What makes you who are the folks that are exceptional, or like the folks that are the subject matter experts, are the folks who have lived through it and who have experienced these systems. And as we work in coalition with folks, I think sometimes lawyers end up taking up space a lot, right? And, take up a lot of air, because it's this kind of air and this kind of this kind of priming of, being told that, oh, we understand the law, and so therefore we are experts in some way. And I think that like part of, using a law degree is to recognize what you learned, but also recognize kind of the limitations of what we've learned, and knowing that it's that community work, it's that it's the policy work, really, right? Because all law is a social contract, right? And so where Yvette and I sit at the policy stage is really kind of the sausage making of what law is, right? It's us as a community deciding what the rules are that we will be governed by, and how it is that we're going to choose to spend our collective resource. That's all budgets are. So at the end of the day, like, I think as a legal worker, it's really essential to also know that, like, the policy space is really, I think, where power moves. And I think my ultimate revenge, every time I pay my student loans, I'm like, okay, I'm democratizing the law. I'm helping people understand that the law is not something high and lofty. It's not something objective. It's not something neutral at all. It is power, right? Law is power. Law is how it is that we have configured ourselves to hold power. And some people hold power in ways that are death-making to others. And we as policymakers, we as visionaries, we as people who are in community together can recreate the rules. We can rewrite the rules. We can write the rules, pass it, get our comrades and homies, to go up for it and make sure it gets voted in, and make sure at the implementation stage, like, that really is the law. That's the law moving. And so I think it's really exciting to me to be at that stage of lawmaking, at the policy stage, at the community organizing, community education, helping people to really understand their power. One of the trainings I'm really excited to do for our members at SC Justice Group, and I don't know if I introduced SC before, but we're a loving and powerful organization of women, gender nonconforming folks who have loved ones who've been incarcerated. And one thing I'm excited to do is provide a training that really helps us to look at the federal system of government and understand how all power returns back to the people, right? So really, to me, as an abolitionist, it's really democratizing the law and helping people to see it for what it really is, to demystify it, and to empower people to go boldly before their legislators, to go boldly, because to help them understand, they pay for the chairs, they pay for the table, they pay for every single thing in the building. This is our house. And so therefore we can go up to them with confidence, knowing that we are the subject matter experts and they have to listen to us because we literally pay them.
I'll speak about, what I try to do in law classrooms when I'm teaching future lawyers. One thing that I think is important that a lot of students don't get is learning the law within its relevant social, political context. And so what I try to do is actually, teach my students that the law is not some neutral thing that self-emerges, that it actually reproduces social hierarchies, it reproduces white supremacy. That way they can start to interrogate some of their premises, some of the assumptions behind the law. And, unfortunately, that's very rare, right? Students often tell me they don't get that in most of their legal classes, which is a shame, right? And, I think the way that legal education is generally organized right now is to just reproduce the status quo, to maintain precedents, maintain things as they are. And I guess what I hope is that students who come through my class are at least willing to question why things are a particular way, engage in some of the advocacy that both Yvette and Titilayo mentioned, and to reimagine what the law could be, or even thinking outside of the law, right? And to be creative as opposed to feeling bounded by what it is, right? And start to interrogate our assumptions about things like property, or even what is a crime? Why is certain forms of conduct criminalized, right? What norms is it reinforcing, right? Is it ableist in certain ways, and so on, right? So that's my goal as a law teacher. But as a scholar, I think, I'm starting to think about questions that interrogate some of the assumptions about, dominant approaches to policing and the criminal legal system. So some questions I've been thinking about lately is, can we still describe policing as a public good when it's been a source of so much harm for Black people? For me, it seems like such an obvious question, but it's a question that's really not addressed in a lot of the scholarship. And then at what point will we start to consider the insecurity and the violence that police bring to communities when we're assessing the continued value of policing as an institution? And what are alternatives for true forms of community safety, right? And these are questions that right now feel underexplored in legal scholarship. And, something that I've written about, quite a bit, and, I'm still really passionate about is a lot of my scholarship has critiqued the feminist approach that embraces punishment to the detriment of women from communities that view the criminal system as the source of harm rather than protection. So, for example, I've critiqued the criminalization of sex work. And I think this is a really important issue for abolitionists because the criminalization of vice has been a method for surveilling and disciplining communities that encounter intersectional forms of subordination, right? You label them as being deviant in some sort of sexual way, and you use that as a way to control them. And so that's something I've been really kind of focused on and been examining.
Yeah, thank you, India, for that. Yeah, thank you all so much. Thinking with you all is really nice for me to do. I just want to, say about like how I incorporate abolition. I'm a teacher, so not a lawyer, but still kind of at the auspices of these institutions, which are fundamentally like carceral. Like they're, UCLA, like all universities, is kind of at the seat of power and empire. They are, the epistemological function of empire, right? So it's no mystery that surveillance technologies and capacities get developed at UCLA, at USC, more famously, right? I'm a big believer in education. I've been in school my entire life. It feels like I am a teacher. I'm going to live in school forever because there's spaces of freedom, right? There's spaces of community and personal growth and liberation in so many ways. And but that's the process of like learning. That's separate from the larger institution that are land grant universities that depend on westward expansion, enslavement, both chattel slavery, the enslavement of Black lives, right, in American history, as well as enslavement of indigenous peoples in California and the real trafficking and labor exploitation of what Jody Bird calls arrivants or other migrant folks. So like that institution can't be divorced from that history. So where do we go from there? Like, how do you reconcile those two things, that this place is loaded, right? It has some potential for liberation, for teaching us, for helping us teach each other about abolition and a way forward. And also the university itself has dug its heels in and is unyielding, right? Unyielding to these ideas. And then where the twain meet, we sit, right? And so what are we to do here? And I think as a teacher, what I can do as individual and the students that I'm in charge of and that I get to work with, I can divorce myself from my love of punishment. That's actually, I'm teaching a course right now, and it's my first course where I've been able to fully be like, I don't do punishment here. There's no 5 points off if something is late. There's no grades. You're not being measured against each other. It's not a competition, right? It's a place where we're coming to do this work together. And I've been able to do some of that in my own like just day-to-day professional life, and it has changed my relationship to my work and to students, right? It's no longer punitive. Like they're not scared of me, or maybe you can never get rid of all of it, but they have nothing to fear from me in terms of like retribution. And what shocked me about that is how ready we all are for punishment. We actually are really comforted by it. And as students and folks in the world, I think that we really get almost affirmed in a way by punishment. And so part of that work is recognizing that love of punishment that I have, or like a dependency of punishment, and to start to divest from it. And that's, long personal work, I think. But it's work that you can do in relation with others, right? We teach each other, we hold each other to account, right? And step away from punishment. And to those who say like, maybe there isn't a practical use for abolition in the legal field or in academia, I guess I would just say, where have you been? like, who do you talk to? Because have you looked outside? Like, there's an absolute urgent need for abolitionist practice, for more generosity and care, for a deep suspicion and skepticism of these institutions, for a refusal at the crumbs, right? Like, yeah, like this, a rejection, what we need. Abolition teaches us to want more, and it stops us in many ways as an ideology. It stops us from accepting the crumbs from these institutions. So it's absolutely practical to demand more, to demand justice. It's changed who I am as a teacher and a friend and a comrade, to others when I stopped valuing punishment. And it only makes space. You forget how much space these things take up. It makes so much room. So if you want to be, I guess, kind of a relic that nobody talks to because you're kind of irrelevant and refuse to change your political engagement with what's going on, then I guess you could say abolition isn't practical. But I don't know. I feel like that's a losing strategy. And I would kind of roll my eyes at that person, really, and make fun of them with my friends, because I'm like, what are they talking about?
Thank you, Stephanie. As a current law student, I can say there's a lot of eye rolling and a lot of text messages making fun of professors who might give us some pushback to our abolitionist thought. And going into that specifically for our lawyer and our law professor, how do you incorporate abolition into your learning, and how do you view abolition as furthering our understanding of the law and legal doctrine? This is a pushback we get a lot in class, is that abolition is irrelevant. We're trying to learn the rule right now. We don't need to be bringing this up in a case about, incarceration and crim law, whatever. So yeah, that question I think would be valuable for law students.
Well, in terms of how I incorporate it into my learning, I feel like I'm still learning. I'm still growing. I feel like I've learned so much from organizers and from groups that are doing the work. A lot of the groups that have already been mentioned, reading critical resistance material, reading Insight, reading some of the, I guess, Nordic philosophers that inspired some of that work as well. And so for me, it's, for me, it's been acknowledging that it's a process, and, it, I'm not at a place where I feel like I know everything about abolition, but I'm open to like continuing to grow and learning from sources that, that at times and in certain spaces are just discredited and not fully acknowledged. But in terms of, how do you deal with it in the classroom? I think, abolition is so important and relevant in terms of just critiquing some of the assumptions in the law, right? And when you're dealing with criminal law, why is the response to criminalized conduct? Why is that the automatic response? Why shouldn't abolition be thought as another theory, another way of being in this world for people to relate with one another, right? And so, I think in terms of trying to get those professors who have been pushing back, perhaps sharing some of those materials with them, sharing the importance and the relevance with them. I think, if they are criminal law professors now, there's a lot of scholarship that is starting to emerge that focuses on abolition. And if they're, current in their own field, they should know that, right? And I feel like, just giving that alone, this should, the fact that there's so much energy, so much attention, and so much, time being spent on, really explaining this as a theory and a way of looking at the law, that they should also be introducing it to students, because you're going to encounter it, right? It's going to be something you're going to encounter, whether from your clients or when you go into practice, or just as a point of discussion. And it's something that, you should really be informed about, and it should be taken seriously, right? I think one critique of, abolitionists, arguments that I often hear amongst, criminal law scholars is, well, what are you going to do if there's harm? What are you going to do when you have a dangerous person? How are you going to deal with, harm? And I think there's like simple responses to that. It's like, do you think people actually feel restored through the criminal system? Like, are we achieving our goals through the criminal system? If we're not, why do we keep going to the same system to resolve issues that it's been unable to resolve? There are alternatives. Why not spend some time exploring those alternatives, getting us up to a point where we can actually engage in those alternatives, be lawyers who are equipped to, engage in restorative justice practices, or at least know about them, right? As opposed to just thinking that there's one way of doing things, right? One way that hasn't been successful, right? And so, I know it's really challenging right now for law students, right? Like, how do you bring this to your professors? I think there are, a number of professors right now who are starting to learn and, maybe open to it, especially if you can, share some of those materials with them as well and let them know, this is something that is gaining, additional attention. And we think this is something that we're going to need when we become lawyers practicing. And so, in a way, you kind of have a duty, to expose this to us and to show us, these alternatives.
Thank you for that, India. And like, similar to that point about like, how is it practical in like legal scholarship, or like, I became an abolitionist in law school, and part of how it happened was like a student movement. I went to Harvard Law School, and like the seal of the school at the time was the seal of the royal family of slavers, right? It was 3 sheaves. And it kind of burgeoned as like a student movement to like demand, like once people realized that like the endowment that began Harvard Law School was from slave labor, was literally from slave money, then folks were like, we need to actually address this. And of course there was resistance, which then led students to occupy the law school. And during that occupation, honestly, was my education, where we sat as students and learned from each other and learned critical race theory and just had conversations about the alternatives. So it doesn't even need to like be about the professors. If you're not getting your education from the people that you're paying, while that is unfortunate, that doesn't limit your education, because the students around you are also your educators. I learned so much from organizers who really helped to like provide me that kind of questioning, and that kind of audacity to really interrogate whether or not, to India's point, we're actually achieving the aims that we're setting forth in our like through the criminal legal system. And I think, even those professors and even the pushback that you're getting as students, like that's again how white supremacy perpetuates itself and shields itself, because it then tells you that you don't have any right to question, that you don't have any right to like really interrogate and question why it is that we're upholding precedents that came directly from slavers, that people who did not see me as a human being. I think it's really, again, coming back to the understanding that the law, it's not really about the rules, right? Like the rules are it's a political tool at the end of the day. And the rules were created by people to maintain power in a specific way. And so at this time, if that way of maintaining power doesn't serve us anymore, that it is incumbent upon us to learn different rules and learn different systems. And unfortunately, we likely will have to create those incubators of our learning for ourselves, but it is well worth it in the end, because it really, they like the professors may not be on the leading edge of what you need, and sometimes you have to be the ones to push them. And even, excuse me, even during the occupation, like when we occupied the law school for like several months, we invited law professors to come sit in the classes that students were teaching. So again, create your own microcosms and bring other people in. And I feel like that, spaces like this are really powerful in helping students to really come to their own political understanding of the law.
Thank you both for that. And am I back? Sorry, my hotspot turned off, which means I'm going agree with both of your comments, both about learning from other students and also, I think, pushing professors. I've always told people that I am a difficult law student and I take pride in it. I'm difficult in class. I'm always pushing back, but I found that to be really fruitful, both in teaching other law students who will be future professionals and future lawyers, but also in changing law professors' perspectives. So in fact, actually, this whole event, I think I've told some of you, is kind of a protest event in which one of our professors was continuously pushing back students early in the semester about bringing up abolition in their class. And so I think to law students who are listening to this to really take that advice to heart. My last question before going into a few Q&As, which I think a lot of our discussion has answered, is what do you tell students and mentees who are having difficulties reconciling being an abolitionist and being in academia and or the legal profession?
Yeah, I can answer. Yeah, with my students and my colleagues and myself, right? How do we reconcile our relationship to these institutions? I think, yeah, I think that conversation is the same in all of those, which is I remind myself of a practice of fugitivity. That moment, that discomfort you feel, that like rub, where you're like, how do I know all these things and hold all these politics and also still exist in this space? That tension is, I think it's like touching a hot stove and you're glad you feel it's hot, right? It's because then you at least understand that how to keep yourself well and you know yourself differently. Like I know where my politics are because this thing feels hot to me. So that discomfort I feel at UCLA and institutions, I taught in a criminology department and I was like, oh God, like those moments of tension, they require tending to, but I'm also really glad they're there. So I think the first thing I tell students is like, that's a good thing that you feel that rub, because it means that, yeah, you're aware of what's going on and you're starting to locate yourself as a political being and thinking, you know, your body is telling you what you feel about these things, is intuiting. And those are really important things to pay attention to. Yeah, and to also kind of embrace that discomfort, because it's only through our objection to our pain and harm that we have started to articulate what we want instead, right? That talking through those moments is actually gets us to a place of abolition. So yeah, I think that those moments are good, even if they're very uncomfortable. And then, yeah, about a practice of fugitivity, or right, the knowledge from the undercommons, right, Harvey and the undercommons, is like, I'm here to kind of get what they've got and to go. Like my allegiance isn't to that institution, it's to us. So my whole, you know, my politics isn't anchored to the success of the institution, it's anchored to our survival. And so I think once I did that shift, it really helped me to just get to these institutions, get what's going to be useful to me, and be prepared to get out, right? And I think it serves your mental health, it focuses your politics, and it shows you who your like comrades are in that struggle. So I'm here to rob, I'm here to take what was taken, I'm here to take back what was taken, and then I'm going to go. Right. And I think that to me feels pragmatic enough and real enough that it has helped.
Yeah, I think for students and my interns and mentees that I come across, I see a lot of the same impulses that I've experienced, during my awakening into abolition. This impulse to just go hard, go really big, and I love that energy. I think it's important, and it's also not necessarily sustainable. And I really like to remind folks that, abolition is a marathon. We have little sprints along the way, right? There's ebbs and flows, but it's really the long game that we're trying to play here. And oftentimes, I saw the question around like how capitalism intersects, right? Part of the unlearning that we have to do around capitalism is that constant impulse to feel the sense of urgency around everything, and having to feel like you have to be a certain level of productivity all the time, and that's capitalism, right? That's how like capitalism and white supremacy has just infiltrated our brains. And so part of sustaining the work for the long haul, part of caring for each other in the work, is also giving ourselves the grace to step back. And kudos to Titilayo for taking care of herself and still being here today for this conversation. But part of being in sustained abolitionist work is really taking care of ourselves, giving ourselves permission to take breaks, step back when we need to, because that gives others permission to do the same, right? We have to model the type of sustainable work that we want to see. And so that's not to say don't bring the energy, don't bring the excitement. When we learn about different models and different ways of being, it's exciting, it's energetic, it's celebratory. And we need to also integrate those healing practices, those wellness practices into our everyday life and into the work, so that we have folks not burning out, and we have folks along the journey for the long haul.
Thank you all so much for your insight and for your advice, and again for your time. We really appreciate it. I think we have time for maybe one more question from the Q&A. I do think that a lot of what we talked about answered many of the questions, if not all of them, in the Q&A. But I think specifically one that I'd like to bring attention to, I think because it's relevant, and I think it's something that a lot of baby abolitionists or aspiring abolitionists are thinking about, is thinking about the Chauvin trial. How do we move forward towards abolition and also hold killer cops accountable? It's a small question, I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, like you're getting a lot of silence because this, even when I heard your question, I was like, shit, this is hard. Yeah, I think so. As I mentioned, I work at SC Justice Group, which is a powerful organization of women who have loved ones who've been incarcerated. And so one of our members, she's been a member for over 5 years. And last October, she just works in criminal legal reform, demanding accountability from her government, et cetera, as just an organizer. And then, last October, LA County Sheriff's deputies killed her son, one of her daughter's partner. And, in the work of, like, these systems are truly horrific, y'all, right? Like every single thing along the way is a fight, right? Like they killed him, and then they held his body for weeks without allowing his family to see him, told the family that his face was so brutalized and beyond recognition that they couldn't even provide a photograph for them to the family. Even getting the autopsy report, et cetera, has been such a fight. And as SC Justice Group is an abolitionist organization, right? Like, as we're working with the family about, like, okay, what do demands look like? What do we need to be pressing for? Like, those sets of questions that went through earlier, in terms of, like, when we're making demands, when we're pushing our lawmakers, like, the kind of, like, beyond the horror of your own personal experience. As abolitionists, we are also accountable to a certain future, right? And that there's that ugly tension as you're holding, and in this COVID-19 era, we can't even be holding hands with folks, right? Like, as you're holding a family in that deep grief, and like working with them about like, okay, so what does the policy outcomes look like? What does accountability look like? Unfortunately, it's sick in the system. Civil lawsuits are often like the most kind of tangible means of accountability. And part of like the work along the way is making sure that you're thinking about the civil case and making sure that like the family's rights and their claims are all preserved, right? And making sure that they're connected to legal counsel. But then there's also that policy aspect of like, okay, what is, you know, for example, like the first demand is we need to release the names of the officers who killed Dana Malik Young Jr. That was his name, Dana Malik Young Jr. Sorry, I didn't say it earlier. You know, and of the over 920 people that LA County Sheriffs and LAPD have killed, just LA, since 2000, so many of those families are still demanding the names of the officers who killed their loved ones. Second, in terms of like, okay, then accountability, like beyond even getting the name of this individual who killed my loved one, just civil accountability in terms of like removing their ability to be on the street, removing their ability to harass family members. Like we're part of the LA County Check the Sheriff Coalition, where families of loved ones who've been killed by sheriff's deputies, because there's just so many that we are able to form a coalition in this way. They, you know, recently put on a panel where they retold the harassment that LA County sheriffs, you know, like just feel so emboldened and embrazened to do, where like on top of like killing your loved one, they show up to your vigils, right? They take the loved ones of the people that they've already taken, and like, you know, arrest them and hold them and with no real charges, ride them around the city for hours and then drop them off, right? Or just riding 5 sheriff cars in front of your house just to intimidate you. So yeah, like I think the answer is like, it's really hard. It's really hard on the ground in terms of like making abolitionist demands beyond like prosecution of killer cops. Because at the end of the day, like I do not like, while DA Gascon is a progressive DA, like we cannot go into his office and be like, prosecute killer cops, because it's not really going to actually hold people accountable. As I began this session with, like cages don't actually hold people accountable. So then what do you do? And I think it really is, for at least the family of Dana Malik Young Jr., as we're fighting, it really is that structural change. It really is the demands for the names of the officers, demands for the civil accountability, you know, the removal of their badges, the removal of their firings, removal of their pensions, et cetera, and just actually just naming, just exposure. And yeah, and just continuing to work at the structural level in terms of like, you know, but yeah, like I feel like I'm rambling because I just don't really have the answer. It's really hard. Mm-hmm. And it's honestly just the scariest part of this work, because it really shows you like, who do you call when it's the police that are killing your loved ones and then harassing them on top of that, just to gloat and show how impervious they are to actual any meaningful accountability. And when you go to lawmakers, they're like, oh, I'm exasperated too. I've been in this for 30 years and I know the sheriffs act like this. Yet you feel like you have no power against them. It's crazy. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, and thank you, Titilayo, for sharing that experience that SC members are experiencing regularly at the hands of law enforcement. I mean, Justice LA just held a vigil on Monday on the angelversary of John Horton, who was murdered by the sheriff's department inside of Men's Central Jail. And we were met with over 300 sheriff's department officers in full riot gear to our vigil. And that's the level of response and harassment by the department. And so often when we see these cases where an individual cop is being held to account, or at least the system is walking through the motions of justice, right? Because we know that the vast majority of these cops are never held accountable. The narrative is that this is one bad cop, right? The bad apple narrative, right? That it's not indicative of the system. You just have this one, rogue cop that committed this atrocity, if that. And what to Tilayo's words, what our communities deserve is not just holding this one cop accountable, is holding the system accountable for what it perpetuates, holding the entire sheriff's department accountable. And part of that accountability is taking away their resources and their ability to inflict harm. Like, that is a step towards accountability, right? And, you know, and Alicia spoke about this, that, you know, when someone is a defendant, they're advised not to admit guilt, right? They're advised not to take accountability publicly, right? And so even if this cop is convicted, that doesn't necessarily translate to support for the family that experienced the loss. It doesn't translate to true accountability and admitting guilt and actually working to rectify the harm that this cop and the system inflicted on our families, right? And so this idea that just prosecuting this cop is actually, you know, bringing justice for this family or preventing that harm from happening to begin with, it's a false narrative. It's a false narrative. But I know that even within the abolitionist movement, there are different positions on whether or not cops can be prosecuted, and that's okay, right? We have a diversity of thought. Where abolitions are not a monolith. You know, we have different experiences, and, you know, I can't in good conscience tell a Black family that just suffered a death to not call for the prosecution of that killer cop. Like, I personally can't in good conscience do that. And we can empower that family with demands that stretch beyond that single killer cop, that will actually translate to true justice and true accountability for that family and the entire community that is being harmed by these systems.
Yeah, only thing I'll add to, you know, both what Titilayo and Yvette were saying is absolutely right, that, you know, it's really the system that is also should be held accountable in these cases. I understand why, you know, a family would want to see the person who murdered their family member, you know, put away. I understand that instinct. I understand that impulse. And for me personally, I'm not going to devote my energy trying to critique that family, because there's so much more to critique about, you know, this world and, you know, just this punitive system that we're in. But I think, you know, it wasn't just a failure of that individual cop, as Yvette was saying, you know, that bad apple narrative. It's a failure of that person's supervisors, the culture that they were in. What culture were they in that they felt that this is okay, that they can get away with it? How many times have they done it? Because it's not just the first time. How do people speak about that community within that police station, right? It's not just that cop. Because if an officer can do that in public, in front of so many people, so many bystanders, there's a real culture of corruption within that entire police department, maybe within that city, within that state, right? And so, you know, that's what can get lost sometimes when you focus on that individual prosecution, that really there's so many people that need to be held accountable who facilitated the conditions that allowed that person to feel comfortable even doing that, you know? And we only have these little tidbits that end up getting recorded, but there's probably multiples and multiples of people under that same situation who didn't have the benefit of having people record at that precise moment, who suffered certain injuries, right? Whether they were killed or not. And so I think that's like fundamentally like the issue that, you know, can get lost sometimes when we just focus on the one prosecution.
Yeah, thank you all so much. And I'll only briefly say my own caution to myself. I very much agree with all of you say. I don't see a lot of value in me criticizing other people and their grief and how they're strategizing go forward. But I will say for myself, for my own kind of intellectual growth around what justice looks like when a terrible violence is done, what justice looks like here, what is the answer to this problem. I do like to give a moment of pause before a knee-jerk reaction, which is always just to further entrench ourselves into the system, right? Into the you know, and I always don't, not criminal justice. What's it? It's like the criminal punishment system, right? It's the seduction of empire is just like, I called 911 and this is the answer, or they did something wrong and now they get prosecuted and they go away. And that's kind of, we pretend like that's a panacea for all the deep harm that was done. And so I guess instead for me, I don't have the answer. None of us do alone, but my instinct is for looking for justice around killer cops and people, other badged or unbadged cops in our communities and what they do. I would say let's wait so that in our haste to provide justice and security for each other, we don't actually end up strengthening the system that spells the ruin of our lives. So is it just the easiest thing to just say prosecution means justice, right? Or when we remove that whole apparatus from our view, what becomes possible, right? What could justice really look like? What would accountability look like? Yeah, that's all I'll say. Thank you all so much for what you said.
Okay, am I back?
Yeah.
Sorry, my Wi-Fi cut out. So thank you all so much. I'm sorry I missed that last bit, but thank you all the panelists for your knowledge and for, again, all of your labor. We are so thankful that you all are able to take the time to be with us today. Just for my closing remark and statement, I just want to return back to my land acknowledgement, where I said that decolonization and abolition are the only paths forward in which all Indigenous peoples will be free. I want to note that I also think that decolonization and abolition are the only paths forward in which all people, Indigenous people, and all other people will be free. And so I want to close with that today. And again, thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.